Okay, that was a little snapshot of what we are going to talk about today. Welcome in, bom dia, todos e todas. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Diep. I am a research scientist working at the Urban Systems Lab, directed by Timon McPhearson, with whom I'm organizing the session today. We are representing Natura. Natura is a global network of researchers and practitioners working on urban nature-based solutions and related concepts. So we have a fantastic line of speakers today, but we do have a little change in the agenda. So Shie Bastida was here with us earlier, but she was called to attend another event. So unfortunately, we won't be having an opening note with her. But we have Cinnamon Dobbs from University of the Andes, Rob McDonald's from the Nature Conservancy, Pipin Andersen from the University of Cape Town, who are joining us online. And we have Natalie Seddon from the University of Oxford, Najma Mohammed from UNEP WCMC, and Eduardo Prondizio from Indiana University. Mary Dupar also could not join us because she's part of the negotiations, so she sends her regards. So we have divided this session into 4 different parts. We will start listening to Timon, who is going to be talking about the importance of climate action and biodiversity action in cities and why we need nature in cities. And because this session is part of the launch of the NATURA Global Roadmap for urban nature-based solutions, I will tell you what our key messages are, the messages we have been working on with a team of 80 plus people over the past nearly 4 years, which we are ready to share. And we will also hear from Cinnamon, Pippin, and Rob, who are joining online, who will be sharing some regional insights. And then we will proceed with a fantastic panel. So I'm going to turn to Timon. So Timon is professor of environmental studies. He's the director of the Urban Systems Lab, which is located in New York City, based at New York University. He's a lead author for IPCC and IBES, and he's also the co-founder of Natura. And he co-leads the NATURA Global Roadmap, and I have the pleasure to share that role with him. So over to you, Timon.
Thank you, Loan. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you for those who will eventually see this online. We are recording this for everyone else. I just want to kind of set the scene in terms of the importance of nature-based approaches for climate adaptation. We're here at COP30. Obviously, there's a lot of discussion around the future challenges, what pathways we're actually on in terms of the climate challenges that are facing cities around the world. It's very clear that cities are on the front lines of climate impacts. We've seen this in so many cases, but it's very interesting just to understand the role of cities in planetary change. Earlier last week here in the Planetary Science Pavilion, we have heard the major challenges that are happening at a planetary scale, of the boundaries that are being crossed, of the tipping points that we're already starting to see. Cities are responsible for 70% of electricity use, 70% of the emissions, and about 70% of people will very soon live in these urban environments. On the other hand, they're also incredible places for innovation. About 70% of the global economy is driven by urban economies. So in that sense, there's both cities on the front lines of climate impacts, but also the places for innovation and the potential for real change. I will also, though, mention that when we think about those climate impacts, they're very pressing. The risk of inaction is massive. We have that economy, that infrastructure that's concentrated in urban environments at risk from floods, from wildfires, from heat waves, from many other types of weather-related events that are being fueled by climate change. And some of the estimates put that the losses that we're already experiencing at up to 250 billion a year. Now, if we accelerate forward the pathways that we're currently on and the amount of climate change that's built into the current system means that that increase in the frequency and intensity of these types of impacts will be with us for at least a couple decades. The last IPCC report was very clear that the next 1 to 2 decades of climate change are already built into the climate system. So this means not only that drawdown, fossil fuel drawdown and mitigation is incredibly important. Of course it is. A lot of what COP is being discussed is about how to make that energy transition, that fossil fuel phase down transition. But what we're also seeing is that cities absolutely must adapt for the current and future reality. What is that adaptation? What does that resilience look like? Of those major planetary challenges, as we mentioned, cities are major drivers of that change, and yet we also see that both nature has a potential role to play in that adaptation, in that resilience building, but at the same time, nature is at risk. If you look, and I don't have the maps here in front of me, but if you look at where cities are expanding around the world, urban development is expanding in every single biodiversity hotspot on the planet. So urban decision-making, urbanization, is on the front lines also of impacts on biodiversity loss globally. All of this bubbles down to the role of cities in planetary change, the role of cities in the way in which that decision-making, that governance, can actually recenter nature and climate change adaptation. And yet, at the same time, we see that cities have not quite gotten there. In a recent report, in this case from the World Economic Forum, we see that if you look at the 500 largest cities around the world, a little over a third actually have some kind of plan or action that is devoted to nature or biodiversity. This is not good enough. We have to do more. What we have seen in global assessments like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Assessments, the Policy Platform for Biodiversity Ecosystem Services, IPBES assessments, is incredible work to synthesize the state of knowledge. But we also, in the NATURA network, as Loan mentioned, realized very early on, years ago, that there's not enough understanding of the state of knowledge and the state of practice on where nature-based solutions are actually working in urban contexts around the world. And that's why we developed the Global Roadmap for Urban Nature-Based Solutions. This is the first of its kind global assessment on the state of urban knowledge that's driven by regional profiles in all 7 regions around the world. Just to give you a little glimpse of this, and then Loan will come up and talk through some of the major key findings that have come out of this global assessment, is we pulled together not only the state of the literature, analyzing over 1,000 articles from all of those regions, including gray literature, white literature, but we've also pulled together 150 representative case studies. And by that I mean cases that are representative of the kinds of practices and knowledge that are happening in every region of the world. Pulling all of that together allowed us to produce, and we're launching here today at COP30, the executive summary from the Global Synthesis, but also 7 individual regional reports for the state of NBS knowledge and practice in every region around the world. Just last week, at the beginning of COP, we launched the European report. In a couple weeks, we'll be launching the Asia report, and over the coming weeks and months, we'll be phasing out every single one of these regional reports. So it's really exciting to be able to share with you today some of our findings from this major assessment over the last 3 years. And that assessment comes on the backs of a number of amazing scholars, some of whom you will hear from today, including on our advisory team. As Loan mentioned, we'll hear from Rob McDonald and Pippin Anderson, but also contributors like Cinnamon Dobbs in a few moments. But in addition to that, some of our other key colleagues here. And I just want to mention again that this is not a single sort of entity that has somehow pulled this together. This is really built on the expertise and knowledge from each of these regions. Every single region has experts in those regions that have driven forward the knowledge assessment from there. So I'm going to pass this to Loan because what we really want to dig into today in this session is what are we learning? What are some of the bright spots and the key examples that we can build on, that we can scale, that we can replicate, and we'll discuss that with our panelists, but also where are the challenges and how do we have to go further? So Loan, I'll pass it back to you.
Trying to juggle with all my things in my hands. So the process of the Global Roadmap initiative has brought together knowledge from academia, from academic publications, together with practices from the ground, illustrative case studies, as well as the expertise that every individual of the different teams we have worked with have brought. So I'm going to present to you the key messages that have emerged from this process. And the first one really is about taking stock on urban nature-based solutions to understand what we need in relation to resilience building. So as Timon said, nature-based solutions in urban context matter to build resilience, to protect biodiversity, to address health risks, and to address social inequalities. The question is, what do we know and what are the knowledge gaps? The latest IPCC assessment highlights that NBS benefits can add up where they effectively manage multiple of these risks. A few examples of evidence of positive impact include evidence around heat mitigation and stormwater management. So there is consistent findings showing that well-managed blue and green spaces in urban areas can reduce runoff volume by up to 90%, for example. We also see an increase in publications around health, how nature-based solutions can address both physical health in relation to cardiovascular risks, for example, but also around mental health to reduce stress, depression, and anxiety. Now the aim is that cities take action on these risks and build local resilience, and that positive impact accumulates at scale. These can help meet international targets, like the Global Biodiversity targets, as well as the Paris Agreement targets, particularly when these actions are deliberately aligning with those targets. So for example, the city of Durban in South Africa has developed its own biodiversity strategy. And today, Durban has been protecting about a third of its land and waters. And it has been doing so explicitly aligning with global biodiversity framework targets. Now, for Durban, together with different cities around the world to collectively contribute to global goals, there is a need to address knowledge gaps. And this starts with understanding where nature-based solutions can tackle multiple risks at the same time, including in underrepresented regions. So the reason why I'm saying this is because the current knowledge on urban nature-based solutions is quite dominated by European framings, and this is visible in the landscape of knowledge production. So we have found in our review of the literature on urban nature-based solutions, peer-reviewed papers, that more than half of Europe is represented in papers in terms of case studies. We also have over 70% of studies that include European authors. Meanwhile, there are huge regional gaps. So regions like the Middle East and North Africa, Oceania, are much less studied. And as we know, and you have seen in the video, we can't use one-size-fits-all NBS models. So there are many knowledge gaps that need to be addressed for different nature-based solutions in different contexts. So I was talking about academic knowledge, but there is an equally important gap when it comes to learning practices from the ground. Every single one of our colleagues in the regional teams have reported the lack of documented case studies, particularly for community-led practices on the ground. Meanwhile, indigenous knowledge is recognized as important, but because it does not necessarily align with dominating Western frameworks that capture and share knowledge, it remains underrepresented. So there is a clear message coming from this. We need to better support existing initiatives happening on the ground, and we need to support them to support what nature stewards do, as opposed to new top-down practices that reproduce exclusionary cycles. There is greater recognition that equity and justice must be at the center of nature-based solutions. However, there is still a long way to go. So when we have reviewed our 150 case studies, we have identified that as much as 59% only use minimal or zero consultation with communities on the ground. However, bright spots centering justice, not only in terms of distribution of benefits, but also in terms of recognition and in terms of participation, do exist. So I'm going to give you an example from the Europe report, which our colleagues in Europe have documented, which has taken place in Italy in the peri-urban of Finale Emilia, where an association called Ruman has worked together with cooperative and with youth groups and with asylum seekers to apply regenerative agriculture techniques and have managed to create a food forest that has produce not only great ecological benefits, but have also created space for inclusion and for care for people who are normally marginalized from these type of cases. I really recommend you that you check the report. It was published last week, and you can find it on the website. This is the first of our 7 regional reports that has been published. A common issue that you all know here is that nature-based solution actions remain very siloed. And there is a clear need to rethink how they should be integrated across different sectors and what this means in terms of changes in the governance structures that we work with. NBS needs to be part of all sectors, and here I'm talking about sectors that range from housing, water and sanitation, and energy and transport. And only then, through this systematic integration, we will be able to valorize different synergies from nature-based solutions actions. So cases that have done this include Singapore, with its city nature strategy that has used or put nature as a priority and used it as a cross-cutting theme in all sectors. And today, Singapore has an estimated 48% of wind coverage. But of course, Singapore has quite a distinct governance structure, and so it's quite a unique case. So let me talk to you about Brazil. We have a colleague, Fabiana Utri, who is part of the Federal University of Paraná, who has been looking at how NBS appears in all the policies and regulations across Brazil for urban context. And she found that over 900 policies and regulations talk about nature-based solutions and related concepts such as green roofs and green infrastructure and ecosystem-based adaptation across over 380 municipalities. So that's promising, especially because many of those were regulatory types of tools as opposed to just policies that put NBS as an add-on. However, this is still quite recent, and we will need to pay attention to how policy coherence work for the future within and across municipalities and different governance levels. So this doesn't come as a surprise, but climate action is underfunded. So UNEP released earlier this year a report showing that the adaptation finance needed in developing countries will be as high as 310 billion US dollars per year from 2035. And this gap is even more real in cities that remain underfunded compared to the scale of the challenge. Urban finance is largely financed by public funds, which means, and you cannot do it alone, which means we need to think carefully about how private actors are involved, and not only in terms of size, but also how they can be better involved. So we have seen cases where cities have creatively brought together public and private finance. So a case in point is that of Freetown, where the Tree Town campaign that was launched in 2018 has aimed at planting and growing 1 million trees in the metropolitan area to address risks such as floods and landslides. And for doing so, the way it started was with funding from UN agencies, from the World Bank, from philanthropies, etc. And by 2024, it was on track for its targets. It had planted more than 950,000 trees at a survival rate of 80%. And each tree had been assigned a token value placed into a wallet in the market that allows financial compensation for local stewards. And this has supported the project in sustaining over time. It's an example of a system designed to direct resources to frontline communities whose labor keeps the project going on. Monitoring, evaluation, and learning keeps being one of the weakest links. However, it's one that could really take us far. And monitoring and evaluation can help us create the evidence base to capture where to prioritize action, and it can also give us the detailed landscape of return on investment to really understand what it takes to get the benefits and by when. Some initiatives have developed MEL strategies that integrate into education models. So in New York City, if you have heard of the Billion Oyster Project, it's a project that has been led by the city and has aimed at restoring the coastal ecosystems of New York City to protect it from storms and the impact of climate change on the coast. And it has adopted a very participatory monitoring type of approach by involving over 100 schools from the city that work on the monitoring stations that are around the city. And not only this has helped to learn about what the best way to protect the oysters and create habitats and maximize the impact, but also it has created the next generation of stewards who learn about marine ecosystems and who learn about monitoring methods. I was also just talking about the Freetown the Tree Town campaign that has a very strong participatory component. In fact, they have mobilized stewards, tree growers, as they call them, all around the city that have been using a very elaborated system with an application where they can track how the trees are growing. This is data that is also checked by volunteers. And this has helped to really inform how the project is growing and to know which trees are doing well and under what conditions. Now, and I'm going to stop here, when it all comes together, this is where NBS can scale. And when we talk about scaling, we mean scaling out across sites, sectors, and context, which requires expanding ways of knowing to better learn how NBS and related approaches work differently across different contexts. Scaling up across governance levels, requiring to move from pilot projects to more institutionalized ways of integrating nature-based solutions. Scaling deep into social and cultural systems, and scaling long, which is about the long term, and that requires creating the long-term evidence for nature-based solutions. So these are the high-level messages that the NATURA Global Roadmap for urban nature-based solutions have been working on. And as I have emphasized, these key messages have different colors and nuances when we zoom into the regions. So now we are going to move to the next part of the session. We're going to hear from our three colleagues who have been important parts of this collective endeavor and who will give us reflections from their regions. So we will start with Cinnamon Dobbs. Cinnamon is an urban ecology and forestry scholar working at the University of the Andes. Her research supports the understanding of how nature-based solutions deliver ecosystem services and how this shapes policy in Latin America and beyond. Cinnamon has been one of the lead of the Latin America and the Caribbean team for the Global Roadmap. And so I welcome her to come online, to come up.
Thank you. I can see myself. Can you hear me well? Yes, awesome. Thank you very much for the invitation. I wanted to start by thanking the co-authors of this report. So I'm going to mention the lead ones, but there's so many people involved in these findings. So Taisia Marquez from Peru, Elizabeth Cook from the United States, Fabiana Goodrich from Brazil, and Tarin Sanchez from Mexico. So I wanted to tell you a little bit of what we found. And one of the main outcomes that we got is that the use of nature in Latin American and the Caribbean cities is not new. However, the concept of nature-based solution has recently gained traction in some of the planning policies and decision-making that is being done in the cities, which is largely influenced by international agendas and the funding available for Latin American cities. So most MBS in cities were implemented in large economies such as Chile, Mexico, Colombia, Argentina, and Brazil. They focused mainly on flood regulation, water quality, and heat. And biodiversity conservation was quite well mentioned, but it was mainly mentioned as a co-benefit of nature-based solution. Another aspect that was important for Latin American cities is that nature-based solutions were seen for addressing economic well-being and inequities, which is quite a problem within the region. And the most common MBS that we found were green spaces, urban forestry, and urban wetland. We found much less from the smaller interventions such as rainwater gardens or green walls. When we look at implementation, we can see that this has been largely supported by international global organizations, technical cooperation, and network agencies, showing that the funding within the region is still a little bit scarce and it is still quite new. And but the main aspect is that we didn't find the concept really embedded in the planning and policies nowadays. So an example of that, we look at Santiago, Chile. They have developed a green infrastructure plan with a wide range of stakeholders to address some challenges related to heat, pollution, and inequities, but they don't mention within the plan the concept of nature-based solution. More recently, Chile has just launched their strategy for greening cities at the national level, and they call it of green infrastructure and NBS. So we can still see that the concept is not completely adopted in the region and is slowly getting more traction. A second aspect or a second outcome was that NBS is an opportunity for creating community and enhancing inclusivity. And one aspect of that is by leveraging migrant, rural, and indigenous people knowledge into urban areas, which is used to implement a lot of community-based, nature-based solutions. So there's an opportunity to strengthen the NBS concept by acknowledging the plural values of nature and the diverse ways of knowledge that are currently overlooked when mimicking some global north approaches to nature-based solutions. And one of the mediums to do that is through grassroots initiatives. They are really good at incorporating those diverse values within NBS implementation. So an example that we found from that is Inmigrantes Reconquistas from Argentina. They were doing urban allotments that incorporate knowledge from female migrants from Paraguay in collaboration with rural migrants from Argentina and university students. So this project not only served to showcase the knowledge existing within the community, but also to build more capacity within the community with this different type of knowledge. Another example that we have from that is Aquafondo Amuna's recovery in Peru that utilize ancestral knowledge to address water-related challenges, while at the same time they strengthen women empowerment for land access through the implementation of the project. MBS in general is quite strategic and opportunistic in Latin American countries, leveraging multiple finances resources and building innovative partnership in order to implement NBS. So majorly the funding goes to piloting and implementation of MBS, not so much to monitoring and evaluating, but some of the funding schemes in Latin America have been quite successful. An example of that is Fondo de Agua, which was initially developed in Ecuador, but has been successful in mainstreaming MBS for water management, not only in Latin America and the Caribbean, but in other regions of the world. We found several initiatives funded by international grants, such as Programa Ciudades Resilientes in Bolivia and City Adapt in El Salvador. However, those funding schemes were lacking the biocultural context of MBS implementation in Latin America. We found a lot of smaller MBS that were mainly grassroots initiatives that required multiple sources to be funded. So they were slowly funding all the process of implementation. So one example is Humeral Angachilla in Valdivia, Chile, that received municipal and regional funding. Projects like City Adapt in Jamaica, El Salvador, and Mexico are also funded through different sources, more international sources. Finance becomes innovative then in Latin America in order to kind of maintain or sustain the project through times. But the other aspect that we found is not only budgets are important, the importance of allocating adequate time, resource, and capacity that nature-based solution needs was very relevant in the region. So that means creating a governance schemes that is adequate for multi- and transdisciplinary work is quite of a challenge within the region. So an unusual case in Latin America was Aquafondo Amuna's recovery project. And I want to mention that because they did invest in doing initial monitoring of NBS impact. And that provided evidence for them to show the success of the project that allows them to gain more funding for other stages of the project, which is a really good way of trying to maintain the momentum of NBS implementation. So in general, if we start monitoring in Latin America, we can address some knowledge gaps on NBS related to the periphery of urban areas, what happens with NBS and informal settlements, what happens with addressing some social environmental challenges that occur only in LAC. How about long-term efficiency of these different NBS? So there's still a lot to do in Latin America in relation to NBS. And I want to close up with how we can connect better NBS and their impact to the social challenges that Latin America and the Caribbean has, such as housing needs, poverty, informal settlements, and land ownership. So it becomes imperative to do those better connections in order for us to communicate how NBS can support these other social environmental problems, where community and decision makers come to realize the importance of nature-based solution to address multidimensional vulnerabilities and not only climate ones, including those actors too from the beginning of the planning process of NBS. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Cinnamon, for this very comprehensive summary of what you found from NBS practices and of the whole range of knowledge you have gone through for the Latin America and Caribbean region. I'm going to turn to Pipin now. So Pipin Anderson is a senior lecturer at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. She examines urban ecological processes and biodiversity in cities to advance just approaches to urban NBS, especially within African context. Pipin has been one of the leads of the Africa team for the Global Roadmap for Urban Nature-Based Solutions. Over to you, Pipin. Welcome.
Thanks, Loan. Lovely to be here. Just to echo Cinnamon to say that obviously what I'm presenting today comes from a myriad of other joint sort of partnership work endeavors. But so this is an overview of the Africa Nature-Based Solution Insights. And I thought I would just kick off with a bit of context and then share our findings. So I think it's important to remember that the UN and UNICEF estimate that Africa's population will account for 40% of the world's total by 2100. Urban Africa is growing at about 3% per annum, most of this in small and medium-sized cities. But predictions suggest that Africa is looking to add 1 billion people to its urban population by 2050. I cannot overemphasize the profound nature of this population and simultaneous urbanization growth. Africa is also at the same time described as the most climate vulnerable continent. Our combination of predicted climate change impacts, weak governance and GDP, poor climate readiness, social vulnerabilities with high poverty and informality, all suggest our climate resilience is extremely low. If we think of the World Bank's aspiration that NBS or nature-based solutions should address the combination of social and environmental threat in the face of climate change, you would almost think the concept was devised for the African continent. Our explorations and sort of digging around and looking into data showed very limited publication under the banner of nature-based solutions in Africa. Luann showed this in her original graphics. There is, however, evidence that the idea of nature-based solutions is starting to get into policy, in particular on the back of the African Union Agenda 2063, which lays out this vision for sustainable development, climate-resilient communities, and economies run by African citizens. The bulk of the meat of our research and our real understanding on the uptake on nature-based solutions in Africa comes out of our case study research. And we found considerable excellent work underway, ranging across NGOs, national and local government, private sector, and in many cases in very successful partnerships across these entities as well. So what did we learn in the process? So despite its apparent tight fit with the African agenda, there is poor uptake of the nature-based solutions concept in Africa. we tend to use different terminology, and I think this is a function of the fact that we're less exposed to and perhaps less driven by research funding that comes out of sort of contemporary academic debate and concepts emerging in the global north. Our work also suggests that nature remains a rural or conservation-focused imaginary on the African continent when it comes to research. There is policy uptake, but it's very slow. There's something of a view in Africa, this may apply elsewhere, that once something becomes policy, it dies. And I think this is testimony to sort of turgid, bureaucratic, financially constrained government on the continent. We did, however, find fantastic case studies of work that was underway, had been underway for a long time, fully operationalizing the nature-based solutions concept. So even if termed a little bit differently, we found a lot of really interesting work underway. And when we look at those case studies, we come away with a few really key sort of takeaways. Funding is really important. Nature-based solutions that prosper are those that are funded through blended and diverse sources. So often the key to achieving success across ecological and social benefits with funding is quite difficult, but where you've got multi-funded, sort of multiple funders in a space, leveraging different demands on a project, this seems to make for a particular kind of catalytic success. There was a really lovely Urban Greenways example of a nature-based solutions project in Burkina Faso, funded across different agencies, that was attending to urban heat island reduction, and also with a lot of fruit tree planting and food security benefits as well. So these kind of hybridized projects in terms of funding are very successful. Innovative sustainable funding schemes have also emerged in a number of cases. So the Global Water Fund projects, I think, are a classic example where downstream users pay upstream landowners for water quality protection. And then Loan also mentioned the Freetown Tree Town project from Sierra Leone, where every tree planter can ultimately sell their established tree on private and public carbon markets. These are both really great examples of innovative financing models. Just as it's hard to establish who pays for both green and grey infrastructure, where it is resolved, there can really be a significant strength in these slightly messier funded projects we found. They seem to have slightly longer lifespans and more cross-scale buy-in. So that is something to really look for and lean into. On the continent, there's obviously we're constantly fighting environmental inequality that has emerged out of colonial historic legacies. And power dynamics really emerge as important and really matter in nature-based solution projects. Local needs must direct funding and investment. One of the most successful case study projects that we looked at or came across was it's a farmer-managed natural regeneration project in Niger that is entirely farmer-led, and it's several decades old. It's been going for a very long time. It's very successful. When we look at these kinds of projects, it really underlines the fact that local communities know best what they need and must be heard. Our work shows the significant value of the inclusion of intermediary actors. So where there are sort of NGOs that's between society and government or between society and international funders. So groups like your Slum Dwellers International, the Center for Community Innovation, Konki Design, ICLEI Africa. These entities take a really useful and important brokering role in fostering nature-based solutions project success. Excuse me. Nature-based solutions are most effective where they tackle multiple problems and yield multiple benefits. There's a lovely case of an urban river restoration project in Beira in Mozambique that was seeking to improve water quality, but also really to simultaneously reduce urban flooding. And there were lovely sort of recreation space spin-offs for people living in the city. But these kind of multi-benefit, multi-problem projects are often most successful as well. And we need to really start building good monitoring frameworks to capture those kind of multiple benefits. There's a lot of skepticism around the feasibility of nature-based solutions work in informal settlements. So limited space, rapid, haphazard growth, infused with sort of really pressing social demands, make these very difficult spaces to roll out nature-based solutions projects. These are sites that are often excluded from formal planning, budgeting processes because of the kind of legal, financial, and technical challenges that they provide. And so they're often avoided, but they're also our most climate vulnerable spaces as well. So informal settlements are prime sites for nature-based solutions work. And mechanisms need to be tailored to the specific needs and the realities of informal settlements, which have this kind of overcrowding, limited space, high social survival demand. So it's a very particular kind of space in society. But there's significant scope for leveraging nature as a means of mitigating environmental injustices experienced in these spaces. And I think with 2/3 of urban sub-Saharan Africa already living in informal settlements, it's critical that we really focus our attention on these spaces. There is some work going on in these spaces, but it is relatively limited still. So in conclusion, the two authors, Scott and Lennon, in a 2016 paper say, we will inevitably have to see a disruption to our planning and theory and practice as we face questions of uncertainty, risk, vulnerability, and adaptive governance. And they propose a deepening of the ecological turn as one way of addressing a deficit in our approaches. And I think Africa really represents a significant opportunity for just this. There's considerable scope for a lot more nature-based solutions work to be done on the African continent. Thanks, Luan.
Thank you so much, Pipin, for grounding us and reminding us of what's at stake. I'm going to turn to Rob. Robert McDonald serves as lead scientist for NBS at the Nature Conservancy Europe. And among many topics, Rob has worked on impact and dependencies of communities on nature and how nature can increase resilience in the face of climate change and health risks. Within the NATURA Global Roadmap, he has served as an advisor. And I'm passing on to you, Rob.
Hi, yes, good to be here. I hope you all can hear me okay. I am maybe less brave than my panelists, so I have a few slides, which may also reflect my different role here. So this is going to sound different because I'm not giving you a readout on a particular region's findings, but my role was more on the global advisory group, thinking about what are the main messages we're learning from the roadmap, and then reviewing some of the European findings, which were quite extensive. So in Europe, there's just a huge use of the term nature-based solutions and a huge body of practice and scholarship around it now. I was asked to just give some reflections, maybe from my personal perspective or quirky perspective on partnerships, right? What do partnerships mean for urban NBS? And then say a few words about finance, which has come up already in our talk. So I guess the first point I wanted to make was it was just so striking being part of this process. And I should say congrats especially to Natura for getting this global roadmap out, and all the regional reports are coming. It was so gratifying to see how much the body of literature around nature-based solutions has grown. I think it's fair to say we now have a pretty mature body of papers, a good evidence base, at least for the biophysical links between nature-based solutions and human well-being. So this particular slide talks about street trees, but you could put up something like this for many different kinds of nature-based solutions, right? We have a sense that there's this multifaceted bundle of benefits that we're getting from nature, and that there is a value proposition for it. Now, as Loan and others talked about, quite a big difference between regions in the strength of that evidence base, and there are still big gaps around monitoring, especially, and costs of implementation. But at least on the ecosystem services side, it was gratifying to see how much evidence there is there. So, if we know nature is so wonderful, I think the question we have to keep asking ourselves is, why do we see scenes like this a lot? Why do we see cities that are not using nature-based solutions as much as they could? Either the urban tree canopy is declining, they're not using it fully for managing stormwater, they're not thinking about it adequately in the heat action planning. Yeah, I think there were a lot of moments when we were doing the report where we realized, oh, there's a few good projects here, and the scale is much, much bigger. And we're not getting to that scale. That was a consistent theme in the reports for a whole number of reasons. And I would encourage folks to check out the executive summary, which sort of lists them. There's 5 or 6 or 7 sort of big barriers to scaling up that we listed there. And I wanted to kind of talk a bit about just one, which is this idea that while nature-based solutions provide benefits in multiple ways, most of the institutions that have to implement them, especially municipal institutions, think about a certain thing, and they don't have as their mission thinking about that whole bundle. So if you picture in many cities, street trees like this are implemented and maintained by the roads department. So they don't have as their mission primarily to provide ecosystem services or cool the urban heat island or provide health benefits. They're mostly in the business of keeping roads going and sidewalks going. And so there is a big mindset shift that has to happen to have multiple institutions working together and overcoming that wrong pocket problem, right? That in most cities, the people who have to pay for nature-based solutions and maintain it are different than the other institutions that might benefit in terms of health benefits, climate adaptation, or mitigation benefits, et cetera. So maybe this is where partnerships come in a bit as a partial solution. I was going to just give a case study of how bespoke these projects are. So the Nature Conservancy worked on a small-scale project in 3 schools in Germany. This was with German Environmental Action, sort of greening up some schoolyards, right? And this was truly a pleasure to be involved with just helping school kids plant trees and to give you a sense of the before and after, this is what these spaces looked like from a very gray pavement-filled space to very green spaces. So, great that we could do that. But if you think about the number of institutions that have to partner to get this done, so the Nature Conservancy was playing a role more, in this case, in sort of funding, technical advising. German Environmental Action had a lot of the staff on the ground, but you had to have buy-in from the local schools, their students and families. You also had to buy-in from the school districts. You also then had to have buy-in at the regional or national level to this kind of work because they were parallel government grants. So I think this is hopefully reinforcing what some of my other panelists said, that successful projects often involve a number of stakeholders. They're co-developed on the ground, and they often involve blended finance models. So that is all true, and maybe that is a strength of MBS. But it is also what makes them a challenge to scale. And I think we need to think through that some, that as long as each project is fairly bespoke and involves an individual group of stakeholders, it may not accelerate fast. And so one of the things I've been trying to think about is, well, what are the kinds of nature-based solutions delivery models in a policy sense or a funding sense that might help us get to some of this circle I'm showing on the screen. So, if we believe urban tree canopy has benefits, for instance, of reducing urban heat island, then how do you link up those in the health sector concerned about heat waves with those who are maintaining or planting urban tree canopy? How do you both jointly plan, but then share funding and resources when both sides, the urban foresters and the health sector, feel very tight for money? So I guess in my day-to-day work, this is still one of the big challenges is silos between agencies to getting to scale. And I hope we talk about it some in the roadmap, but I hope as a field, we start to move from proving that nature-based solutions work in a biophysical sense to thinking about how do we deliver them at scale And to me, it's almost like we have a stormwater utility, we have electric utilities in most cities. We sort of need a nature-based solutions utility that will help us plan for and implement nature-based solutions across that whole bundle of benefits. Yeah, so obviously there's other funding schemes. You all are in Belém at the climate COP, and there's a lot of discussion under Article 6 about carbon sequestration, and that is a funding source for some projects, much less for the kinds of urban projects that were the focus of this roadmap for reasons that are probably good. So still quite controversial. We found talking to folks about whether we should be thinking about carbon, evaluating carbon in our NBS projects, but certainly it is a funding scheme that is out there. And there's others. Loanne in her introduction mentioned stormwater. It's interesting for me to contrast stormwater with, say, heat, right? So urban heat island, quite clear biophysical value proposition connecting tree canopy cover to air temperature mitigation and heat risk mitigation. But in most places, there's no law or regulation that makes it easy to finance projects. In comparison, stormwater in the US and the EU is fairly easy to get nature-based solutions funding for because there's very strong laws that regulate pollution into waterways and regulate combined sewer overflows. And there's incentives against combined sewer overflows and pollution. And so municipalities and governments at many levels have to think about reducing stormwater pollution, and they have funding schemes to do that, and they will turn some of that funding towards nature-based solutions. So this example here was a project we did in Washington, D.C., which has an interesting stormwater retention credit tradable market. I guess policy matters, and those background policies we're finding determine which ecosystem services really have value and which ecosystem services don't when decisions are getting made and when these NBS sites are getting built. And so finally, I'll just mention water funds and this idea of connecting water users who might be concerned about problems with water security, either too dirty water or not enough water, with actions upstream that might maintain source water, quality or quantity. Our first panelist mentioned projects in Ecuador, which is one of the places where TNC started working on this, but there's many places where this model has worked. And what's interesting about this model is connecting the center of a city where the people are with actions that can be dozens and dozens of kilometers away. I've had the pleasure in Sao Paulo to go to some of our projects in Extrema, Brazil, and you're several hours drive away from Sao Paulo, downtown, but yet there's a nature-based solutions, in a sense, that is taking place in a quite rural farming area that is linked to Sao Paulo's well-being. So funding models like this and others give me confidence there is going to be money out here for nature-based solutions, but we do have to think about correcting that wrong pocket problem I talked about. And I'm just excited for hearing the discussion after this and seeing how we as a community can move this conversation forward. So I'll pass back to you, Loan.
Thank you so much, Rob. I'm picking up from Loan here. Appreciate all three of our online panelists. Thank you, Rob. Thank you, Pippin. And thank you, Cinnamon. We're going to turn now to our in-person panelists. So I want to go ahead and invite up Najma and Natalie and Eduardo, who I'll introduce in just a moment. You can take a seat anywhere, please. Thank you. So we're going to hear from three of our panelists. As we mentioned, we've had a little bit of a change, so Mari Dupar cannot make it with us, but I just want to introduce, starting with my left, Najma Muhammad. Thank you so much for being here from UNEP. She's a policy director at WCMC. And also Natalie Seddon, who is the founder and director of the Nature-Based Solutions Initiative at Oxford University. Thank you so much for joining us today. And then also Eduardo Brondizio, who's a recent Volvo Environment Prize winner. Congratulations and well-deserved, Eduardo. Former co-chair of IPBES and also professor at Indiana University. And I want to kind of pick up on the last comments that Rob mentioned here. He was talking a lot about scaling and all the various ways of scaling. And we're going to get to a number of comments that our previous panelists talked about in terms of the need for governance structural change, about some of the importance of how we can mobilize finance. But Eduardo, I thought maybe we could just start with you and your experience in these kinds of assessments. This is an assessment, but we're here at COP30, where there's a lot of assessment work out there. Here, this is of course focused on nature-based solutions in urban, but a fundamental question really is, when we pull together this kind of knowledge, as we look to actually trying to transform urban development on the planet in a way that can cause positive change, both local change, but also change at a planetary scale, what is the role of assessments? What can we mobilize in terms of policy action? And maybe even a question to embed in there is, at what scale can we have influence? What can we do with this kind of knowledge? And maybe we can build from your IPPES experience, just to kind of start us off. Thank you.
Thank you for being here, and great to be here with you. So let me start with a comment on IPBES. So IPBES is the Intergovernment Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Service, right? And it has a particular history, a history that comes from the conservation community, from the ecological community. And I think I would start that it's still today, although we see urban issues increasing in a platform like IPBES, it's still not a center, it still hasn't gained, I think, enough attention in a platform like that. It reflects the historical development of these different communities. The conservation community, the development community, and the urban community, and are still sort of developing parallel. We see that growing interface in a platform like IPBES. For instance, the global assessment that I co-chair, we address urban issues, but it wasn't central, to the IPBES. You go to the more recent assessment, the Nexus assessment made urban issues much more central, and then you have the transformative change assessment, and now we have a new phase of assessment, which is connectivity and spatial planning. So it's a very long process of bringing urban issues to the core of a platform that concerns with biodiversity and ecosystem service. And I think that's the next frontier, right? I think that, I can see that, the next work program, I would hope, would be explicitly connecting the climate agenda, the biodiversity agenda, the urban agenda, and the development agenda much more, explicitly. So it's part of a development that is pushing each of these communities, to find bridges and language for each other. There are different ways that assessments, and first there are different kinds of assessment, and assessments are user-driven. So it depends on the prioritization of the users, right, to make those questions central to an assessment. But if we look back, IPBES has a very nice tracking systems of impact. And you see the impact of different assessments be uptaken at the city level, at the national level, at the planning level. And it's interesting that sometimes, the impact is about creating awareness. So when we release the global assessment, talk about trends in biodiversity, there are a number of cities that start to incorporate our findings by simply be aware that they have to incorporate biodiversity in their spatial planning. So that's one way, just raising the issue and put that on the agenda, creates change. Policy evaluation, that's another way that assessments can have an important role. You evaluate policies and see what are the limitations of the policies, for instance, in addressing issues. I think there's an opportunity to find some cross-cutting themes that would bring those agendas together. And I'll give you one example that I think it's still under-discussed and where all those issues interact, which are delta regions, for instance, just saying that we are in a delta region, right? So delta regions are the most densely populated areas in the world. right? Most of the population that will be sort of experiencing sea level risings, and that by far most are in deltaic regions in the global south. It hasn't received the attention I think that it could, but it's one example where you can find themes that connects the global interests of a global platform, regional interests, because these are region-specific problems, and local issues, where people experience a global change like in Delta regions. This region, and I'll talk that when, the next round about the Amazon in particular. This is a clear example where most of, maybe half of the population in this city and in other cities around here are experiencing flooding and under conditions of precarity. Half of Belém is considered subnormal occupation. It reflects very well what Pippin was talking about for the African continent. So I think there are themes that could bring different communities together, push the boundaries in terms of how do we conceptualize those connections, and at the same time addressing issues that are affecting a lot of people. So I think we need to find those middle grounds where those communities converge, and they converge with the problems that are being on the ground. This is one example, focusing on Delta region, which is global and at the same time, relevant to most of the global south.
Thank you, Eduardo. I'm glad you brought up Delta regions because I've been thinking about them a lot, largely from this densification issue, right? These are these areas that are high density locations, and in a sense, of course, they're very urbanized, right? With high impact. I want to turn to both Natalie and Najma, and maybe Natalie, we can start with you, and we'll just kind of come down the road, but to pick up on still this same set of questions, and our goal here is to have some short interventions so we can go through a couple different topics. But as we start to think about the science policy interface, right? Clearly, whether it's IPCC or IPBES or the Global Roadmap assessments or other sort of formal knowledge, there's a fundamental question around how we translate science into policy or even science into other types of actions. So the question really is, where do you see some of the most critical blind spots, whether this is in data or in methods or in various approaches that really limit our understanding of NBS effectiveness? And I mentioned that understanding of effectiveness because somewhere in there is something really important about how we demonstrate effectiveness in order to demonstrate return on investment, in order to mobilize finance, in order to say, oh, policy needs to take action here in some way. So there's kind of a long string there, but thinking about this blockers in really translating knowledge and this type of science into actual action through policy. Curious what you're seeing in your own work or in your own areas. And Natalie, if we could start with you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for doing this roadmap, and this incredible report and this project. So thank you to all the people that are involved. Amazing, and I think much needed. I'm still, very... The fact that 70% of the world's population are going to be living in urban areas by the end of the century, and those people are, they are the consumers, they are the people, the engine of that which is unraveling Earth's life support system. So what we do in cities just seems very critical. So it's really great to bring it together. I mean, I'm sort of worried about the lack of work being conducted in the global south, and there just seems in general, I mean, there's a lot of knowledge needs that are needed around trade-offs and understanding of, for example, a common one is that you beautify a city with green, and you generally drive house prices up and drive poor people away. And so sort of being very clear about regulation around that piece is really important. We definitely see that in the global north, and probably likely to unfold in global south cities as well. I don't want to repeat in terms of blockers and enablers, because there were many that were brought up by colleagues. But I do wonder about a piece that hasn't come up, and that is the importance of citizen science, citizens' assemblies, and that engagement. Because there's a lot there. I've personally been involved with various citizens' assemblies in cities, including with marginalised people in the UK, who feel that their own access to nature is seriously reduced. So I think there's a blocker there, but also there's an opportunity for more city-based citizens' assemblies where people can really talk about nature, what it means to them, what good looks like, and how they can be actively involved in that process of restoration with all the benefits that that would have for their own health and healing as well. So something around that kind of bottom-up citizens engagement, citizens science, I think there's that I don't think came up today, and that I would say that there's a real opportunity there. So I wanted to highlight that for now, but yeah, thanks.
Excellent, thank you so much. Najma, also picking up on this from your experience, and I know you have experience both in thinking about the sort of rights and importance of human rights in this context, but again on this sort of translating science into policy, I'm curious where you see some of the main limitations, and what maybe perhaps are examples where we're overcoming them already that we can build on.
Thank you so much, and we've had one roadmap planned today. Let's hope we have more at this COP. So I think I just want to reflect on the presentations. Thank you, and congratulations to the team that actually had the vision to do regional assessments and then bring that together in a global picture. Because I do find UNEP WCMC is a global, a global center of excellence affiliated to UN Environment Program, and my team works on nature-based solutions across the world. And we are finding that the context and the ecosystem context, the political economic context matters quite a lot when you're trying to find out, the enabling environment to scale nature-based solutions. But as I was listening to the presentation, I was thinking of two things. Firstly, I'm the head of nature-based solutions, so I don't know if I'm doing myself any service here. But the term nature-based solutions, when we're saying it's not, very frequently used in our urban planning context, I do think that if we would broaden, our minds and our thinking about nature-based solutions, I think we will find it. We've had urban planners, landscape work being done for decades to try and, work with nature in a positive way to address urban challenges. So I do think that they are there. I think we've got to broaden our mind and the way we understand nature-based solutions. But a common thread that I've actually heard is that challenge of the mindset shift, of actually being able to think about how you can work with nature, and I guess I'm hoping that we're beyond that, where we want to get nature out of the city, get the water out, get the nature out, this is a place for people. And actually I do think, that bringing nature back into the city can help us not only address challenges, but that broken relationship, that I think that's at the core of the challenge that we're having, So in terms of, how can we enable, the science policy phase enable, I think data is incredibly important to make both the policy and the financial case. But I think we should be able to bring data. The promise of nature-based solutions is an integrated outcome, but we're going to be able to have to measure that. So if we say we're going to create jobs or improved health outcomes or, greater connectivity or, reduce risk to flooding, we need to be able to measure that over time. So it was, not surprising that one of the colleagues who shared was saying that monitoring, evaluation, and learning is still not strong enough. So it is, we've got to bring the sort of transparency for policy and financial decision making, and then the accountability part, which is we've got to carry that monitoring through. And I'm really pleased that Natalie's brought up the importance of citizen science and local people. That's when nature-based solutions hits the rubber hits the road, because nature-based solutions are implemented, in a context. I do think that we have to start thinking of mainstreaming nature-based solutions. I don't think we have the luxury of time to actually establish, new institutional structures for nature-based solutions. So I do think we have a job to work with our engineering engineers, planners, transport and roadworks, the sort of bread and butter of what keeps the city running, to actually mainstream nature into their thinking. And I think they are open. I've had incredible discussions with engineers working on sustainable urban drainage systems, and biodiversity scientists talking about bioswales, but I think they're the same thing. So getting our language, simplified so that we can communicate.
Thank you. I totally agree on the language, and one of the things we certainly saw in the report is not only are nature-based solutions not called nature-based solutions everywhere around the world, right? There's many languages, and so that sort of broad umbrella approach is really important, just even recognizing what's happening on the ground. But I think we've talked about the need for involving citizens, involving local stakeholders in some tangential ways. Natalie, you brought this up, but really kind of underlying this. I think one of the things that we've noticed through the other presentations and also through the roadmap is that we're not invested and mobilized in nature-based approaches broadly in a way that meets the scale of the challenge. And one challenge there seems to be very much about governance structures, governance approaches. Eduardo, again, we'll come back to you. I think along this sort of need for new governance structures or approaches is also the question of what is urban. And I'm putting these two things together because urban networks expand into rural areas. We even saw the examples of some of these water-based approaches that are already linking rural nature-based agendas to needs in cities that are expanding really rapidly. So within the Amazonian context and building on your work here, I'm very curious, where do you see opportunity, bright spots perhaps, where we can start to build that urban-rural connection in a very intentional way through nature-based approaches?
Well, thank you for the question. I'll bring it down to the Amazon. The first opportunity is to make urban visible. Do you think about urban when you think about the Amazon? Most people, it doesn't even fit the imaginary of people. When we talk the Amazon, much more about policy, the urban. Now, which is quite ironic because 80% of the Amazonian population are in cities. 40% of the indigenous populations in the Amazon are in cities, right? These are the most precarious cities that you can imagine because the growth of the cities, now there are about 750 municipalities in the Amazon and consequently cities, which most of them are very new, 40 years old or less, and have experienced an enormous pace of growth. So the first opportunity is to make it visible, as part of the regional landscape, and therefore change mindsets to orient, attention to cities. So the question I think that is really important here, a couple of questions. One is, how do we address basic needs without repeating the approaches that we used in the past that have exacerbated the problems? So the questions here in the Amazon are about sanitation, are about housing, are about garbage, are a number of things that, these are the prominent issues that municipalities are dealing with. And therefore, how do we orient, nature-based solutions to these kinds of issues and think about the scale of how do you address those problems? The history here has been mega projects of gray scale projects. Much of the flooding that we see here are a result of previous projects that have tried to address issues at a large scale using, sort of gray infrastructure approaches and that are exacerbating the problem. So we have an enormous problems of retrofitting and addressing an existing very complex reality at the same time as a future thinking. And here's the other aspect that you brought up in your question that is key here, and it hasn't been part of the conversation. The Amazon, if you look at 10, 15 years ago, we would say you had the urban systems here were not articulated, meaning you have satellite cities in different parts of the region with their own smaller satellite cities. 80% of the Amazonian cities are very small. They're at least below 50,000. And few cities concentrate a lot of people. What's happening in the past 15 years? You have evolved an articulation of regional, sub-regional cities that are now physically connected to each other. And that continues to grow. So this is defining the space of governance for the next 20, 30 years, because this is defining all the articulation of the areas, which is encircling indigenous areas, protected areas, rural areas, right? And creating issues that will continue to have impact in the future. So I think there's a present problem. How do we think about basic needs for millions of people? And how do we anticipate the problems of interurban connectivity and further growth, so they don't exacerbate the kinds of impacts of climate change. It's a very, a tall agenda to address.
It really is, and I think this interconnectivity in terms of the kinds of challenges that we're facing, housing challenges, even fair wages, et cetera, all come up. And nature-based solutions both have an incredible opportunity and a role that can address all of these challenges, and yet we've got a lot of problems to solve as well. And we're running short on time. I want to invert the order a little bit and ask Najma a question just to come back to Europe, and we'll finish with you, Natalie. So just recognizing that we're going to have to finish up a little bit quickly here. But I've just noticed in the European context, dramatic shift from an Amazonian context in some ways. There's over 100 projects that are funded by Network Nature on NBS in the European context. What's really proven effective there in terms of what we can learn from that we can start to get to the scaling problem, right? I think fundamentally what we see and what's come out of the roadmap, all the learning that we have, is scaling is still an issue. What's a bright spot or an example that you can point to?
I mean, I think the bright spot that I think both we share with the roadmap is when you start aggregating your knowledge and understanding, you begin to see the systemic levers for change. And I think working with the Network Nature, it's a partnership, as you said, 105 initiatives that work on NBS that we are able to influence. So we are a mega network of programs funded. And we've been able to do assessments in key systemic areas around policy, finance, and around inclusion. How do you bring previously excluded people into decision-making around nature-based solutions with concrete case studies, with concrete, opportunities of where this actually works. And I think that has actually shifted, and I hope that this team has that opportunity to take what you've done in the roadmap to policymakers and practitioners, because I think we've had an opportunity to do that through the Network Nature program of work, and that's where you actually begin to share the examples and say, well, this works in this particular context. So you find, even though we've done these assessments around policy, modeling the policy landscape that enables nature-based solutions across Europe, modeling the finance landscape and the instruments, and maybe I can share one very critical example there, and then also sharing examples of how previously excluded or commonly excluded stakeholders are actually brought into decision-making. We often hear a lot of buzzwords at the COP, things like blended finance, but I do think what we really have to figure out is it is incredibly challenging. When you're designing a nature-based solutions project and you ideally want to, for example, make sure that an existing project to achieve scale has that nature biodiversity component to it, you've got to find out which dimension of the finance landscape can fund the green part and which can finance the development, potential part. And that is, incredibly challenging. And I think the one thing that we are struggling with funding for is to actually get the funding to build the partnerships, to build the kind of collaborations, the platforms, the forums that you need, because you don't want this just to be around, from one angle. And I think there's plenty of examples, across the partnership that show that.
Thank you so much, Nadja. And Natalie, we'll give you the last word here. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I'd love to continue this discussion with all of you much longer, but I know you're really thinking a lot about the role of values and even in some ways a total shift from what we've just been discussing. How do we not only move forward on showing the outcomes, mobilizing the finance, getting the political will to really bring this into policy, and at the same time bring diverse voices into this and to really understand that this isn't just about outcomes. What do you see as the opportunity there? Can we do that?
Yeah, I like to say that ideally we want to live in a world where we don't need terms like nature-based solutions, because we're already living in reciprocity with the natural world. And I think there's an amazing study that just came out today or yesterday showing that for nature sustainability, basically showing that when indigenous values around reciprocity, relationality, redistribution and kinship are applied to nature conservation projects, both in cities and outside, and they use something like 160 biocultural indicators, that the outcomes in terms of the societal challenges, whether it's carbon or water or heat reduction in cities or whatever it might be, so a wide variety of societal challenges, those outcomes are much more likely to emerge when the projects were delivered, in respecting those kinds of values. Which is why even if within this space indigenous values are not being very well represented, at least the cause and the plight of indigenous environmental defenders and the fact that so many indigenous people live within the Amazon and within the cities of the Amazon, that whilst the world's briefly looking, that's been highlighted. It's been a really, really good thing. But I think, yeah, getting those biocultural indicators and thinking about what the values we are using, so we're not so much fixed on an outcome which might not be relevant in a warmer world, because we don't really know what's coming. We just know a lot of change is coming. But if we're operating and implementing, designing and financing with these values, then we might get to where we need. More philosophical way of ending, apologies, but there was lots of great practical stuff that came before.
Exactly, and I wanted to end on that point because I think there's not just work to do that's very practical, that's very much about finance or governance, but also fundamentally about mind shifts and how we really think about that behavior change we need that is about our connection to nature. So thank you all. I really appreciate you making time and being here for us at COP30 as we're launching the Global Roadmap. Just to finish up, I think it is fundamental that we have this shift and we recenter nature in every aspect of our urban development, and not only the urban. And I'll just finish and say I invite everyone here to download the executive summary from the Global Roadmap. It's available online now. The European report is there. The regional reports, as I mentioned, will come out in phases over the coming weeks. We'll be launching in every region around the world separately. And of course, the full global synthesis report is finished. It's in design, and it will be out online as well very shortly. But again, thank you not only to Eduardo and Natalie and Najma, but also to Cinnamon and Pippin and Rob online, and to Loan. Incredible co-leadership here. We're really excited to be here for COP30, and we're going to keep working together. So thank you again.